Sorry about that. So anyway, yeah. So here's our story. A little bit of background about our farm. The picture to the left is my family, Lisa and I, and our two sons, David and Stephen. Also help with farming. Our farm. We have a 125-acre farm, preserve farm, that we do primarily pick your own vegetables. There's a sign that we have out in front. Over the season, we grow about 100 different types of vegetables and varieties of vegetables that are available for picking anywhere from late March. So we're already open, except for a rainy day like today, but we're open from late March, pretty much right up till Christmas. So we go through the whole season, with cool season crops that overwinter. Start strawberries probably next week. We'll be picking strawberries, and then right on through to warm season crops and into the fall back to cool season crops again. So we have to deal with the weather throughout the year pretty much. And the changes in the weather have certainly had their impact on our crops. Not all disadvantaged. There is some advantages that I could talk about as well. But the extremes are what we really find difficult to deal with. And so we've had to make some changes in our farming practices to be able to adapt to that. Next slide. So I apologize for this blurry slide. I figured that the text was big enough that you might be able to make out what it says. Does that thing have a pointer on it? Maybe. Yep, thing. There we go. The clicker. Yeah, probably has a pointer. Let's see. Oh, here we go. So this is just from April 2022 to March 2023. So very recent data. There is a division at Rutgers that tracks New Jersey weather. They've got about 60 weather stations across the state. And David Robinson is the fellow who runs that program. And he puts together these really nice presentations. If you ever get a chance to see one of his presentations on climate change, it's really interesting. But what I wanted to point out, just within the last year, we had the warmest August on record. We also had the warmest January on record. So over time, there's definitely a trend towards warmer weather as you look over the past 100 years. We also had a couple of cold spells, but the second warmest winter on record was just this past year, and the third warmest summer in total. So there's a real trend there. Good question. So the next slide will show you that. Go ahead. All right. So this is another one that you need your glasses for, and I apologize, but again, it's just general trends. So it starts in 1850, I believe it is, and it goes right on through till current time. So this first graph that you see up top here is temperature extreme. So this first one is for temperatures, and what it's mapping out is the five warmest and 5 coldest years in New Jersey. So you take a look at more recently, all the red colors. The red is the temperature extremes, the warmest. The blue is the coldest extremes, which tend to be in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so you can see over the last 100 years how there's a definite trend. A lot of the number ones, the warmest years, and number twos are all clustered here within that period of 2000 to 2020. If you look at precipitation, it's a little bit different story. So this is also mapping the 5 driest and 5 wettest years in New Jersey. And you can see that there's red and blue just scattered all across here. So there's no real trend in precipitation. We can't really say that there's going to be a lot more rain, but what they are saying is that the storms are more extreme. So you don't have your 1-inch or half-inch rains as often as now you have 2-inch rains, like we might get today. Actually, they're calling for, you've heard of localized rains where it's sometimes over 10 inches of rain that fall in one spot. And as you can imagine, for a farmer, that's very difficult to deal with because your plants flood out when that happens. In addition to the rain, there's also dry spells that are driven, by hot weather or long periods of lack of rain. We actually are coming right now with this rain, probably to an end of a dry spell that started back in January, where we had like 4 or 5 inches less rain than we normally would have in the spring. You don't tend to notice it in the cold weather because plants aren't drawing up a lot of water. You don't do a lot of planting activity. But if it had continued that trend for any period of time over the next month, it would have been a really bad start for us. I sit on the state's Water Advisory Council, Water Supply Advisory Council. They track the water levels in the reservoirs and what's flowing in the surface water as well as the groundwater. And up until last week, they were really concerned because a lot of the reservoirs were well below normal levels, and hopefully some of these recent rains will help correct that a little bit. But this is the type of information that's available on their website. And again, it's Dr. David Robinson. He heads that up for Rutgers University and draws his data from a lot of these remote weather stations that send the information in by cell phone. And so every day he's got pretty up-to-date information to share with everyone. Next slide. So how does a local farmer adapt to warmer temperatures and more extreme wet and dry spells? That's really what it is that we're addressing or trying to address right now. And so there's some things that could be done to help adapt. But I will say going into this that all these steps normally take more effort and more money to be able to do. And so the bottom line is that, yes, there are things we can do to adapt to it for the current time. But in the end, it's going to mean that things are going to end up being more expensive or that it's going to impact our quality. So this is what can be done to adapt to warmer temperatures. Plant earlier in the spring and later in the fall. Well, makes sense, right? So what we've seen, and I've seen from the time I was just a little kid, is that now we can plant things about 2 weeks earlier than we did back when I was a younger farmer. And we can also plant things a couple weeks later in the fall. So you have your spring crops and fall crops. One rule in particular that my dad was always very adamant about, he said, you got to have things like cabbage and collards and beets, everything planted by the end of July. If you don't, the cold weather is going to get your crop and you'll never harvest it. Well, now we're finding that it's the middle of August and we still have a decent crop when we plant that late. So you can definitely see these trends. And then the same thing is true in the spring as well, that we can plant a couple weeks earlier. Tomatoes, it was always May 10th. Never plant tomatoes before May 10th or else a frost is going to take them out. And now we're planting the end of April. And still, even though you have some cold weather, which it does happen, most of the time it's not so extreme that it takes the crop out. So we're definitely seeing that trend. And I'll also talk a little bit about how we can adapt to some of that as well and what some of the implications are. Select varieties that are more heat tolerant. So you get into the middle of summer and all of a sudden now you've got a spell of weather where every day it's up above 85 degrees for 5 or 10 days. That has a big impact on flowering crops because above 85 degrees for most crops, it really hurts the viability of the pollen and as well as for the flower, the whole flower itself. But pollen, especially above 85 degrees, isn't very viable. So you tend not to get very good pollination. And for things like tomatoes and peppers and corn, that's all really important things to get good pollination on. And so there are some varieties that the breeders have been able to select for warmer temperatures. They just set better when it's warmer. And so in the catalogs now, you'll actually see they'll point out that these are heat tolerant beans or heat tolerant things to plant in the middle of summer. We use a lot of plastic mulch for our vegetables. It used to be all black plastic that we used, but it just got too hot in the middle of summer to be able to plant in late June, early July on the black plastic. So we've now gone to using a lot of white plastic mulch. Anytime after early June plantings, we plant on white. What that does is it reflects the light so the soil doesn't heat up as much. It doesn't hurt the stems of the young seedlings as much. So we do that as well. More crop rotations, because one of the things with warmer temperatures is you get more disease and insect pressure too. And so we have that Crop rotation helps to kind of keep the disease from being close to the new crop. It also helps with the insects that tend to go in the soil to overwinter or to survive from one crop to another. And so doing that crop rotation helps a lot. Utilize summer crops and fallow land during the hottest periods of time. So we have some ground that we just let sit idle until the fall planting season comes. We also use summer cover crops, things like sun hemp and what's the one Dave Frank put? Yeah, red clover is another one, and also some other crops that do okay in the hot weather. They have a quick life cycle, so it's a good crop to use for summer cover and keep the ground full of organic matter. Increase irrigation capacity, both for cooling as well as for giving the plants the water they need. That's also things that can be done to mitigate that warm weather, but it is an issue because that does take a lot of time and money to get set up. Provide shade for heat sensitive crops during hot spells. I'll talk a little bit more about that in some of the slides. And then we also do close our pick your own operation in July, because we rely on customers that are coming out to pick their own crops. July is just too hot a month for most people. They don't feel like picking in the full sun. Can't blame them. They also don't feel like taking it home and preparing it and cooking it. So we try and adapt to that, and it just isn't worth us staying open when no one's coming out to pick. And then prepare for frost and freeze protection in the early spring. So this is kind of an interesting phenomenon with this warmer weather. And it goes back to the earlier slide I showed you with how warm the winter was this past year. Well, when that happens, the things that we're carrying over from one year to the next are strawberries and peaches. They tend to flower earlier when you get that warm weather, but you still get those cold snaps that come in, the 2 or 3 days of really cold weather, or you get a couple really clear nights and you get a hard frost or a freeze. Well, if you don't have some way of protecting your crop from that freezing weather, those flowers that are already out and open will freeze, and you won't get any yield from them. They'll kill the fruit when that young and tender. So we have to take steps to mitigate that as well. Next slide. So what we do in the early spring, and I know this very firsthand because we had to do this a lot this year with the crop being so advanced early on, is when we get temperatures at night that, especially on a clear night, we'll often see where it goes down into the lower 20s. And that definitely is a temperature range that's going to kill our strawberry plants. This is a strawberry crop here. What we have to do is we cover them with a floating row cover, it's called. It's like a blanket pulled over the crop. And then we turn on the irrigation. You can barely see it. I'll show you that in the next slide. But that water applied to the crop actually ices up over top of the plant, and that freezing action keeps the temperature of the plant at 32 degrees, and that stops the flowers from freezing. And next slide. Now this is a movie. I don't know if you can get that to play. This is just a shot of some of the irrigation running in the strawberry field. Let's see if we can get the video to go. Will it go? Will it click? No, it doesn't want to show. Okay. Well, anyway, it's not a big deal, but it's just a shot of how the sprinklers are running through the night. We take turns, my son and I, going out to keep an eye on the irrigation. We'll turn it on normally when it's about 36 degrees and falling, to make sure the plants are wet well before it gets cold. What's that? That's correct. Yep, it is. It's a lot of work, and if it wasn't, for keeping the high value crop alive, it wouldn't be economical to do. You wouldn't see this done for tomatoes probably, or a crop like that. Let's go to the next slide. If we can't get that one to go, there we go. So early peaches. So if you take a look, this thermometer is soaked in water and ice, but that temperature is right at 32 degrees. So that's what we want to do. And this is a peach tree that had been watered probably for 5 or 6 hours overnight. And you see the icicles that are hanging off of it. Kind of a balance there. Any more ice than that would be a real issue because it might start to break some of the branches. But on those tender branches are the flowers underneath of that ice to stop it from freezing. In the background is just some plastic. This photo was taken in probably early April this year. But we've already got peas and fava beans and other crops already planted in that plastic, and that plastic that happens to be black plastic. You can't tell from the photo here, but it's actually warms the soil quicker in the early spring and gets things like peas and cold season crops going a lot sooner. Next slide. So in this case, it's questions about how do you deal with more extreme dry spells. Well, first, probably increased irrigation capacity is pretty obvious. And that is also the way you do that is either bump up the volume or the amount of water you can apply it at any point in time, but also the duration. So this past summer, we had a pretty long, hot, dry spell, ran from July through September. And there was a time when we didn't shut our irrigation pump off at all during the day or night, ran 24/7 for about 4 weeks. And so, that was what we needed to do in order to be able to get the water out to the crop that we needed. And we were using a lot of drip irrigation. So we're using a very high efficiency irrigation system in most of what we do. Not always. We also have sprinkler irrigation, and that uses more water. But drip irrigation, because it's applying the water directly to the soil, and you can do it when it's windy or when it's cold out. It doesn't matter, but it puts it right down where the roots are, and so it's much more efficient than overhead sprinklers. In the hot, dry weather, if you use sprinklers, they say that on some systems, about 70% of the water that's leaving the nozzle of the sprinkler never makes it to the ground because it evaporates before it gets to the ground or it runs off. So you can see how more efficient irrigation systems are better. But again, it comes at a cost. It takes more time and money. Organic mulches and cover crops are very important. The organic matter in the soil not only helps for carbon sequestration, but it also really improves the health of the soil. The roots grow more thoroughly down into the soil. They can tolerate dry spells much better. They're stronger in the wind, which is also another condition you see in weather extremes. And so getting the organic matter built up in the soil is really important. Not just for an organic grower. We're not just organic. We're conventional farmers, but we use a lot of organic practices. But also for conventional farmers, getting organic matter into soil is very important, and that's also something that a lot of farmers are realizing. No-till or reduced tillage practices. These are very good practices to keep the mulch from the previous crop, whether it's a cover crop or a previous vegetable crop, on top of the soil. It protects the soil from drying out quickly, from getting overheated in the sun. And there's new equipment that is designed to be able to plant through that thick mat of cover, whether it's rye straw or other crops, corn stover. And unfortunately, it also means more pesticide applications, primarily for insects that tend to thrive in some hot weather. Not all insects do, but insects like spider mites really like warm, hot weather. They're tiny insects that just, there's so many of them that they just like draw all the juices out of the plant and really weaken it. And there's other insects that also like warm weather. Their life cycles just go a lot quicker when it's warm than as opposed to cooler weather. And for more wet spells, the things that we've done to adapt to that are better surface and subsurface drainage. Again, this is something I've seen change over my life in farming. It didn't seem as though we would get these big rains that would flood a field out for a couple of days when I was a younger farmer, but nowadays we see that every year we're going to get 1 or 2 storms that really flood the fields. And a lot of vegetables can't tolerate sitting in water for very long. So you need to be able to take that surface water off the field, hopefully not take all the soil with it. So you need to have buffer strips and things that keep the soil in the field. but also subsurface drainage, which a lot of times is called tile drainage, you may have heard of. That's installed, and that helps drain some of the water that's in the soil itself back into the ground, or into the drainage ditches. Also, you could grow your crops on raised beds. We do almost all our crops now on some kind of a raised bed, and that kind of gets a strip of soil that most of the plant roots are in up above where that water table would be sitting. If you have a big rain, the water would just kind of sit down in the wheel marks, and then your crop would be okay because it would be up elevated above that in the bed. And here again, unfortunately, more pesticide applications are needed. When you get a lot of rain, you get a lot of disease and insects that are really difficult to manage in wet conditions. And you've got to get into a field that's really wet with your heavy equipment, and it makes all kind of ruts and everything. It's not a good thing, but that's what needs to be done sometimes in really wet spells. And produce crops under protective covers. This is something that recently we've implemented with some success, and so that's also a technology that is expensive, but you know, in terms of mitigating some of the impacts of climate change, have helped us a lot. And if you could advance it to the next one. So we use a technology called high tunnels. It's like an unheated greenhouse. You could also use greenhouses. You can see this is a 20-foot wide metal pipe framed, plastic covered structure. The sides roll up. There's a pipe that winds the sides up for ventilation when it gets warm. But we plant our crops in here. In addition to protecting it from the weather and the wind, it also allows us to be able to plant certain crops like tomatoes and lettuce and things about a month sooner than you could normally do it outside. So you get an earlier crop. Over here to the right is a picture of some of the types of yields that we can get off of a tomato crop grown in a high tunnel. This crop actually was ready in late June, which is early for our area for tomatoes, and it had no pesticides applied. So having that protection of the high tunnel reduced any disease incidents and insect problems because of the protection that was provided by that. So it does protect it from the impacts of the climate. The other thing that we can do in a high tunnel is we cover the roof with a white shade product, like a thin white paint almost. And in the heat of the summer, it keeps the crop cooler. And that's some of that shading that I was telling you about earlier. Yes. So in the end, because of the higher yield per square foot, the cost is reasonable. You can justify it. It's in line with what a conventional outdoor crop would cost per pound of tomato. And with the season extension, you also hit an earlier market that's a higher price per pound. So that helps too. And the same thing in the fall. It gives you about a month extra season in the fall too. We have a lot of customers that like small cucumbers, and so in the fall when they get really torn up outside because of the rain bringing an angular leaf spot and a lot of bacterial problems, in the greenhouse are protected, and they do a lot better for the fall crops. So it's an interesting adaptation for high tunnels. Next slide. So there is a good story to this too, and that's that farmers, depending on how they manage their farm, can also do things to help with climate change, help reduce the rate of climate change. And here's just a few things that you might do. Get more organic matter incorporated into the soil. We talked about that already, but it's a very important thing to do to sequester carbon in the soil. And at the same time, it really improves the overall soil health. I mean, soil in a way is alive. There's bacteria and fungi and everything that's in the soil that definitely help the plants grow better. And it's trying to create that environment for those things to happen. A lot of that is driven by the organic matter that's in there. Tighter control over your fertilizer programs. So you're not just applying all the fertilizer needed for the crop before you plant it. You're putting a sort of an initial starter fertilizer in the soil, but then coming back every week or two through drip irrigation and spoon feeding that crop with additional nutrients so that you're not over fertilizing and having those nutrients run off the farm, costing you money, but also impacting water quality off the farm. Utilize those cover crops because that will soak up the plant nutrients into the crop, the cover crop, and then it'll be available once you turn it back into the soil again. It'll improve soil health and release those plant nutrients back into the soil for your next crop. It also helps with soil erosion control. Clean energy production on the farm in the form of solar or biomass energy. There's a number of greenhouse growers near us that are using wood for heating the greenhouse. And so that's a form of bioenergy. Talked a little bit about solar and agrivoltaics and farming and solar together. That's another potential technology that will help reduce climate change. Utilize your farm equipment more efficiently and look to electrify some of the farm equipment. So traditionally, tractors are either gasoline or diesel. Just as you see with cars, tractors are also coming out now that are electric version. And so they offer a lot of potential because actually tractors need to be heavy to get good traction. And so the batteries, even though they're heavy, are actually a good thing for a tractor. It's just getting them to run long enough that you don't finish the field before you get your work done, you know? So in a way, it's kind of going to be like a DeWalt power tool, you know, the cordless DeWalts and all the other brands that are out there, that there'll probably be a battery pack for the tractor on charge while they're out in the field using the other one, and then swap it out and continue with the farming. And that fits with agrivoltaics really nicely too. Also, biochar is a product. It's not compost. It's actually formed by putting biomass through a process called pyrolysis. So in many ways, it's a lot like charcoal, and it's very inert, meaning it doesn't break down, but it is carbon, and it does sequester carbon in the field, and it acts as sort of like a sponge. It absorbs nutrients and releases them to the plants. And so you'll probably be hearing more about biochar in the future, because biochar has a lot of really good things when it comes to sequestering carbon. And plant trees as windbreaks, also in marginal farmland. Trees are really good at sequestering carbon and keeping the CO2 levels in the atmosphere down. They're good for windbreaks because you really don't want a lot of wind from these extreme storms that are out there that would impact the crop. And in marginal farmland, a lot of times the farmer barely breaks even on his crop because it can either be too wet or that you know, it just in the fall when you go to harvest is just impossible to get in and harvest it. So perhaps look at some trees that could be grown and cultured so that you can harvest them someday. But in the meantime, they're soaking up all that carbon and sell the trees for lumber, high quality lumber. Next slide. Another one of these eye exam charts. I apologize, but it's the climate mitigation potential of 21 natural climate solutions for the U.S. And it's measuring its carbon sequestration potential. And for ag and grasslands, avoided grassland conversion, that is more impactful out west where there's still grasslands. But you can see under that is things like like cover crops, biochar, alley cropping. That's where you plant crops in between other crops. Nutrient management, manure management. That's really important where you've got a lot of animals. Windbreaks and different grazing options too. So there's a lot of things that farmers can do that will be able to be blended into their cultural practices that hopefully in the end will not only produce good local food, but also sequester carbon and help with reducing climate change. And I think that's about it. What's the next slide? Oh, that's just the end. Thank you. So, yes, questions? Biochar, it's a very early industry right now. So it's commercially available, but not much, and it's expensive to get. We think that over time, especially in New Jersey, where there's a lot of biomass in the waste stream, things like pallet wood and tree trimmings from the utilities that are always trimming, the wires. There's the potential to get a lot of biochar from that, but there's really no big commercial industry producer of it out there right now. There is in Pennsylvania. You can get some in Pennsylvania and have it trucked in, but it's expensive. Mhm. So we have bees on the farm, and it's our neighbor who takes care of them. He's a beekeeper, and we work with him on the type of insecticides that impact beehives. The neonicotinoids is one that you see a lot of people talking about impacting the health of a beehive. The jury's still out on whether that they are as bad as some people think they are. But when we're growing a crop that's at the flowering stage the bees are into, we don't put neonics in that field. We avoid that. As a matter of fact, we try and avoid spraying that field at all. But yeah, the bees, he likes our farm because we have things flowering for a long period of time. The early spring crops, once they're done picking, will have some residual flowers, and there's a lot of honey in that. And then right on through the summer. EcoComplex, yeah. So, like I mentioned earlier, I work for the Rutgers EcoComplex. It's in Bordentown, actually just west of Columbus, Bordentown address. But it's next to the Burlington County landfill. It's an outlying research center for Rutgers University for the Ag Experiment Station. And we're located there because a lot of our work has been focused on bioenergy from waste biomass. Over 50% of what we throw away is biomass based. And so if you can find a way to get it separated, things like food waste to an anaerobic digester or wood waste to a biochar producer, those kinds of technologies would keep it out of the landfill, stop the methane emissions that would come from it from getting into the air, but also be able to reuse it and have some beneficial effects from it. It's a neat facility. Mm-hmm. We use it for 2 years. Some growers only use it for 1 year and then they dig it up and throw it out. So there is some issues with it because there is, at the end of the season, this plastic that needs to be dealt with. It has to go to a landfill usually. They've tried some recycling programs for it, but because it's got so much dirt and plant matter mixed in with it, it's very difficult to recycle. But there is a potential down the road that it could be. It would be nice. Right now, I believe that the environmental benefits from it outweigh the liabilities for it. But it does help with creating that microenvironment that helps the plants do better. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So it was funny because I was talking about this presentation to my son yesterday. I said, maybe we should make plans to start growing oranges and coconuts, It hasn't gotten that extreme yet, but we are, the only thing we're seeing right now is that we can start them our current crops earlier and keep them going later into the season, but we really haven't gotten into some of the warmer, like South Carolina, Georgia type of crops yet. I say. Yeah, right. Oh boy, we wish we didn't have rain when we got strawberries in the field. We're gonna have strawberries next week. Next week. Yeah. And it's because of the system that we use is a plasticulture system, and we use that floating row cover on them over the winter to keep them from getting really damaged by the wind and really cold weather. But yeah, this year they flowered much earlier than normal. We had a couple of really cold snaps that we had to bring in the irrigation and keep them from freezing. But yeah, a lot of rain when strawberries are starting to mature is not a good thing. Yeah. Yeah, right. Because we have them up on these plastic raised beds, the water does run off quicker, so they tend to stay drier than on a matted row system. So that helps a little bit. Mhm. Well, that's a good question. Certainly, the windows of harvest have changed for cool season crops like peas and lettuce, and some of your cold crops that don't like hot weather, like cauliflower and broccoli. The summer is, out of the question. You really can't grow it through the summer, but it's pushed the windows of harvest back a little bit into the spring and into the fall. But nothing I can think of offhand that is impacted. Maybe some of the other farmers would tell you differently. Um, Things like cranberries are suffering a little bit because of the heat. They're getting a lot of sun scald now in August that they didn't see before. Over time, that may impact what they can do. Well, it's where Ocean Spray used to have a processing plant, but now, I mean, they're still growing a lot of them down in the Chatsworth area below Tabernacle. And Ocean Spray has a sort of like a refrigeration plant there, but their processing is now in Pennsylvania. Take it out there. Mhm. I'd say there's been farmers that they use it from Florida to Maine. They use it all the way up the coastline, and it's been around for probably 30 years doing that. Hmm. Right, right. Now he didn't grow peaches or strawberries, so his crops weren't as sensitive to a freeze. So we didn't have to do it when I was a kid, but back then they probably would only get it once every 2 or 3 years where they would have a frost that was affecting the flowers. Now it seems like every year you got to do it, because not because it's colder in the spring, but because the warmer weather in the winter has made the crop flower earlier. And some crops like plums, they don't even plant here. That might be one crop that we don't do anymore because they flower so early in the spring that almost every year they get froze out. Um, Still the same types, but the varieties are different. The heat tolerant varieties are the ones that we tend to have to use more in the summer. And they have heat tolerant tomatoes, green beans that are heat tolerant because they get affected by it a lot too. Mhm. Yeah, so we have actually one well now, and that's the one that we had to use 24/7 last summer, and we're in the process of applying for a second well because it was just, too much pressure on that one well. Um, no, and actually, maybe one of the good things is that for a while the aquifer that we would draw from is the Potomac, Raritan Mahogany or something. I think it's down around us around 300 feet down. Anyway, for a while it was being drawn on so heavily that the water table in that aquifer was dropping. The DEP, was tracking that and put a restriction on how much you could draw from it. And so now that water level in that aquifer has come back up again. Mm. What's that? You still need to get a special, go through a special permission to draw from it. So where we are, it's what's called a critical water use area number 2. There's 2 regions in the state with that. So the county has a certain allocation of gallons of water that can be drawn from that aquifer in their county. And in order to put in a new well, you got to go to them first, get their permission from the county. They have like this bank of credits, Then it has to go to DEP, where you also have to get review, and then there's a public hearing session for that. And then if you get all approved, then you can put the well in. So it's a little bit of work. So marginal farmland can be a number of things. It could be ground that tends to stay wet a lot of times. Sometimes it's called modified ag wetlands. If it wasn't farmed, it would be considered wetlands. So those types of fields can be used for tree production, like white cedar, some other hardwoods that like, wet feet for part of the year. It can also be ground that's very slopey. So if you have a hilly area and it's almost too steep to really farm, you can put in a tree crop that you don't have to drive equipment over and grow trees there and culture them in that way. So yeah, it's a complicated answer for you, because when I was growing up, my grandfather and father sold their vegetables mostly wholesale. And at the time, almost all the farmers in our area were wholesale growers. They sold a lot of their produce to either Vineland or Tri-County up here in Heightstown, or into the Philadelphia terminal market, New York terminal market. Over time, that's changed because refrigeration technology has gotten better. So a lot of products are now trucked into the area by the tractor trailer load. And so the local farmers are more just kind of filling in the gaps. When a truck doesn't come in that's supposed to, or whatever, they'll call some of the local growers. And it's not really a good business strategy to build your business around that kind of, I'm filling in for someone else who can't do the job. That may change with the way things are going in California, because lettuce and cool season crop supply from California now is really in jeopardy. But what we have done over time is switch to this pick your own model. New Jersey, because of its high population density, has a lot of folks here that want to get out into the country and bring their families. We also have a lot of immigrants, so first and second generation immigrants to the U.S. who, from their homeland, were used to going to farms and picking to put stuff up for the winter. We get a lot of customers at our farm that are coming from that background. They're immigrants. They want to buy 200 pounds of beans at a time because they're going to take them home and either pickle them or freeze them and have them for the rest of the year. So our model has shifted to direct marketing to the consumer. So the margins are a little bit better. So because of that, we've been able to survive and do okay. If we were still wholesale, it'd be very difficult. What's that? Well, just recently with all the flooding they had, a lot of the lettuce fields have just been wiped out. Yeah, and broccoli, you're going to find if you have a garden, plant lettuce and broccoli, because it's going to get expensive. Yeah, that flooding. Well, eggplant comes from Florida and Mexico this time of year. So I don't know if they maybe had some rough weather down there. It could be. Yeah. Yeah, I hadn't heard anything about that, but that would be my guess for eggplant. We'll have some for you in June if you want. Oh yeah, that's good. Yep. Wow, no kidding. Wow, you wouldn't know it'd be under such demand. So, Lindsay, I don't know how much time we have.
We'll do one more question from Emery.
Sure, a good question. So we're located on Jacksonville Mount Holly Road, across the street from the Springfield Golf Course, if you're familiar with that. And we're open on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, 8:30 in the morning till 5:30 at night, weather permitting, and on Sunday from 9 to 5. We're actually closed today. Worked out good for coming here to give a presentation. The good Lord was taking care of us, let's guess. But anyway, yeah, normally on Sunday from 9 to 5. Yeah, we have a Facebook page. You know what? I should have put that up here. It's Specca Farms Pick Your Own.com is our Facebook page. And that's really where we have day by day availability. What's available. We also have a farm market on 206 called the Corn Stop. So that's down East Hampton way.
That was the perfect last question. We actually planted Anne-Marie.
Yes. Appreciate that.
I just took a picture of everyone who's in here right now, so I can send an email with your Facebook link and those details this week. I can do that. Who in here is connected to the farming or the agriculture industry in some way? Just a couple of us. I know we have more in our congregation, but
it's interesting in our church. One sermon we were like, okay, who's a farmer? They'll stand up. Who's the son or daughter of a farmer? Stand up.
Yeah.
And then, who's like the cousin or someone of a farmer? 90%. So,
and who eats things that farmers produce? Everyone.
Right?
Well, I think we should pray for Dave and for their work, and then we'll head over to worship. So if you want to reach out a hand, kind of as an expression of blessing, and I'll just put my hand on your shoulder, and Lisa as well, his wife. God, I thank you so much for Dave. Thank you for this lifetime of experience that you have given him in farming and in agriculture, for the care and the intentionality that he and his family have put into their work, and for the just abundant harvest that you have brought to them year after year. Thank you for the hard times and the good times and all the lessons that they have learned, and especially now for the ways that they are approaching this issue of climate change and seeking to find new and faithful ways of innovating and responding, so that they can actually be a part of the solution. I pray for each of us in this room as we have listened and learned this morning, that we might also seek to approach our purchasing, the ways that we relate with our agriculture industry in new and intentional ways as well. So we pray over him, especially in this busy season, with the planting and then the summer to come and all of the people who will come out to the farm and pick, that you would bless them abundantly. It's in your name that we pray, Jesus. Amen. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay. I also am involved with VIP.
Yes.
And I head up the agriculture farm committee that's working with the farm in Malawi, the demonstration farm. So that's been a real blessing too. I've been over 3 times now to help with getting that farm put together. So yeah, that's great.
Should have said that at the beginning. That's how.
Right.
So Stephen, I should have said that, but that's how Stephen mentioned you to us. So we're so grateful for you coming. Yeah. All right. So we'll see you next week, and see you in worship in a minute.